Good afternoon, everyone. Happy St. Patrick's Day to those who celebrate. I feel compelled to mention just because I have some very enthusiastic people in my family, which is partly Irish, who want to celebrate it. Um, and I am wearing a green jacket in their honor. But thank you for joining me. And my name is Jessie Clark. My pronouns are she, her. I'm based in Toronto. And I'm just wanting to come on today to talk a bit about the new prime minister and cabinet that were sworn in on Friday. Um, so basically, I have a few different thoughts about this, and I want to put it into context for the work of the progressive people in Canada, for many nonprofit and charitable organizations, for the international development sector, and the people who I know are who I work with as clients, as students in my courses, and just to come on to say, I think give a bit of additional context to what I think that has people have been really concerned and critical of some of the elements of the cabinet announcement that were made on Friday. And so let me just go into that a little bit briefly. So we have a new prime minister because we have a new leader of the Liberal Party. He does not have a seat in Parliament as of yet. And as a result, it's very widely expected that he will be going to the polls very soon. He, I think, also wants to take advantage of, sort of some momentum around being newly elected leader. I think trying to seize the moment where, for after 18 plus months of a 20-point spread in the polls between Liberals and Conservatives, they're now within margin of error distance of each other. And there are some scenarios showing the Liberals winning a fourth mandate. And so it seems like it's a good moment to go ahead. Also because Parliament is set to resume March 24th. And because the new Prime Minister doesn't yet have a seat in Parliament, I imagine that he'll be quite eager to get that full mandate so that he can be in Parliament debating leaders of the opposition and others, or debating as leader of the opposition, depending on how the election goes. But not at least to cede that space for public debate and public attention. So that's the context. I think he came in, with this new Liberal leader, with this strong focus on clearly going into the next election, and also, at a time of a lot of, I think, very, very valid and great uncertainty here in Canada in terms of the ongoing economic threats that seem to also kind of tacked on to sovereignty threats we're facing from the Trump government in the US. So that's just some, the context. I think the context is important because I think, in particular, this is going to be, like I said, likely a very, very short-lived cabinet. This cabinet, may last at most maybe about 10 days. I could be wrong. He might, for some reason, decide. I mean, he has technically until November, or late October to call an election, but it's widely suspected this will be very short-lived. So I think that being said, it's at the same time, it was very discouraging to see some of what was dropped from the cabinet when he announced this kind of new leader cabinet. It's not uncommon, again, for a new leader to come in, announce a smaller cabinet. Cabinets often will expand over time as they're looking to kind of build this broader consensus, bring in issues, try and mobilize in different areas. Especially also if there's an election and there's new candidates elected who are star candidates, that leaves room for that kind of thing, if depending again on the outcome of the election. So I think it's a short-lived cabinet. I don't think that there's time, and I think this is one of the things I really want to talk about. There's not time for them, if the election happens when we're thinking it's going to happen, to do much in the way of policy or make many changes to any programs. So in the very, very short term, in the immediate term, despite the fact that there have been some very significant changes, I think in terms of actual program delivery, there won't be any changes. It's just literally not the time. That being said, I think that also, however, the messaging and the optics are very important. And I think that's where there's really been an unfortunate, maybe lack of foresight in terms of announcing this new cabinet, frankly, because it's hard to ignore the fact that I made a list this morning of which were the former cabinet posts that no longer exist. And again, I want to distinguish, because just because the cabinet post isn't there, it doesn't mean that the bureaucrats are still there delivering the programs. It doesn't mean that there isn't still budget allocated for the time being, at least for those programs. So fine. That being said, though, these things matter, right? And so what was dropped, I think the list is quite telling. And what we've got on the list, first of all, Minister of Women and Gender Equality was dropped. I think that's been, created a lot of consternation in feminist and LGBTQ plus communities, who really had relied on Ministry Yen as a really strong advocate in cabinet. And the optics of dropping them at a time, with a rationale of sort of wanting to have this, this sort of leaner, meaner cabinet to fight trade wars. It's unfortunate, because I think it ends up sort of creating this false dichotomy between having, voice for women at the table, and for gender diverse people at the table, when we're trying to be, kind of serious about economic issues, blah, blah, blah. So don't love that. That being said, I mean, effectively, I think the programming is still there. The funding that exists currently is still there. So, I think that's more of a communications issue at this point. There's also the Ministry of Diversity, Inclusion, and Persons with Disabilities also dropped. Mental Health and Addictions also dropped. Families, Children, and Social Development, that wasn't really a ministry per se. It was one of the ministers of ESDC, along with Employment, Workforce Development, and Labor. But those have been replaced in terms of, I think the term children has been dropped, social development and labor, all of those terms have been dropped from the titles of the ministers. Again, possibly, likely more optics in terms of conveying of priorities. I think effectively a lot of these programs are ongoing. They're not going to be touched at this point. I think a lot of those commitments around GPA plus, around ESD, around anti-Black racism strategy, Indigenous and UNDRIP response, they're all anchored within existing departments and are ongoing. But that's not to say that, it's still sending a message. The other things that have been dropped just of interest as well are all of the regional economic development agencies are not in cabinet positions in any case anymore, and a few others in terms. Seniors is another one that I noted. Official languages, sport, Minister of Small Business, and a few others. So that kind of gives a bit of an idea. I think that it's definitely who sits around the cabinet table is very important. And I would be remiss if I also didn't mention the fact that, as someone who has been, worked in the international development sector in Canada for a very long time, I don't love that cabinet post has been folded in under foreign affairs. I am happy to see it still on the list, however. So, we'll take that as it will. And I'm just noting, Gregory, your comments here as well in the chat. Thank you for bringing those comments. Yeah, cabinet microaggressions. I love that. That's a great way to phrase it. It's exactly not good government PR. I haven't loved. Also, I've been thinking a lot and kind of analyzing this over the weekend and seeing various takes on it. And one of the takes that I particularly vehemently disliked was from a columnist in the Star who was suggesting that, well, yeah, the reason that there's no, gender parity or gender equality ministry is because it's 2025 and you need to appeal to, the young men who would otherwise be voting for Poilievre. I really reject that analysis. I don't think that. I certainly hope that wasn't the intention behind what was done in terms of the cabinet. I don't think it really was, to be honest. And I also don't think we should be in this race to the bottom for sort of, who can most publicly reject some of these really important issues. That's not who Canada is. That's not the Canada that many of us are wanting to defend in this moment. So, I think that being said, like this, I am always someone who's very pragmatic, and I do think that this is a short-term situation, very likely, right? We will see what happens, in the next week or so? Is there going to be an election called? Will we have a new cabinet as a result, or a completely new party at the helm? Who knows? I think some people have been saying, well, this is just a strategic move on Carney's part. This is really just a pre-election cabinet, this kind of trade war cabinet, business. And therefore, we should really just see this as a strategic move to the center. And I think there are a lot of analysts who are seeing it that way, that this is Carney, trying to distance himself from Trudeau, which, given Trudeau's previous unpopularity, is important for any new Liberal leader. And one of the ways to do that is to shift the party to more towards the center. So, fine, from a strategic standpoint, I can see, what they might be doing with that. But I think at the same time, there's another risk there, in that by, alienating progressives, or by at least making people feel that they're not seen and heard, around the table in this government, it sort of takes for granted, I think, the fact that people are going to be lining up behind one of two parties in the next election. But Canada doesn't just have two parties, right? We're not the US. We have several parties people can be lining up behind, and that can also have a lot of consequences. And so I think that's also an important consideration. So there's a lot of pontificating for me. I don't usually talk so much about politics. I want more talk about what it means. But I did want to speak to that, because it is I think very important. I think it's more than, these optics really send a lot of messages, right? That I think are, especially in this day of like constant communication, constant news, constant messaging, have massive reverberations across, kind of broader conversations. I see another comment here as well, saying, disappointed to hear that wage was dropped, interested to see what happens to the women's entrepreneurship strategy. Women entrepreneurs have a lot to offer. Totally agree. And I think, again, probably, where we are in government right now. So, we have kind of the legacy now of programs that were announced by the Trudeau government. I don't think this new cabinet will have the chance to announce a lot in the way of new programs, other than a very tight list of priorities that they see as, kind of the most compelling over the next couple of days. So I don't think that we should be concerned as a nonprofit charitable sector, or as an international development sector at this time. However, I would also say that we're in a time where I'm definitely expecting, to be blunt, to see a lot of, there's, I saw that there's a new minister whose title is government transformation. And I don't think that transformation is about expansion. Let's just put it that way, right? I really think that's going to be, we will expect, no matter who wins any election, and to see some kind of contraction, to see a refocusing around economic issues. And I'm definitely with the commenter there. I reject that there is kind of a dichotomy between diversity, inclusion, gender equality, and strong economies. I think that, in fact, the opposite is true, and that's been proven on many occasions. And I think, that there's also a risk of going too far to the center, as the commenter there pointed out as well. So we're in a really delicate time. I think that that doesn't, what does that mean? I don't think it means we shouldn't be vocal and speak out and talk about what it is about being Canadian that's really important to us, as a sector, as a feminist movement, as to us LGBTQ plus organizations, as other progressive organizations. It doesn't mean that we should be holding back any of our criticism. Far from it. I think that we have, it's really important that we're continuing to advocate and speak out. I do think that this, in some ways, is maybe a bit more of a comms failing or PR failing than a strategic failing, or at least in terms of, rather than a concrete failing around programming specifically. But I also don't want to let the government off the hook that way either. It didn't need to happen that way. There's no need for it to have happened that way. Even if you're trying to consolidate cabinet, which I totally understand, of course, fine, but you can still put portfolios underneath various ministers and still call them out as priorities in a way that has not been done here. I think it's also concerning to see youth, children, and mental health drop as issue. Speaking about issues that are certainly very important to me personally as well. Um, all of that symbolic language sends a message, and I don't think what we want to see is, a Canada that's shoring up to fight for its life, by leaving out people who, are part of what makes this an incredible country. So that's my that's kind of my speech making. I do think that in terms of, advice I'd be offering from to clients at this time, and to people that I work with, because my main role currently is as a government relations consultant. Yes, an explicitly progressive one who works with the nonprofit and charitable sector in Canada. Um, I would say wait a week before you do much of anything in the sense of, reaching out to ministers. I do think it's fine, though, as I said, to be asking for accountability, asking for explanations. Um, I just think that it's going to be there. In the reality of sort of government operations is that it's still very early days in a transition to a new prime minister and cabinet who, in any case, may not be in power for very long. So I don't imagine that that sort of at the civil service level, there's necessarily a huge amount more insight as to what's currently happening, than there is in the public. Because I think we're all waiting to see, what's going to come in the next couple of weeks. And then if we do have an election, which would either be the 28th of April or I believe the 5th of May, what comes from that election, I think that's going to be what we're going to need to be paying attention to. And if I was, going to be focusing my limited resources at this time, I would be focusing them on, what is my election strategy, and also I would say even more so because, I think election strategy has value, but I don't think a lot of organizations are in a position to really move the needle or to really, capture a huge amount of what's going to be a very, very crowded, conversation. I think also to really focus on what comes after that. And definitely try and influence, definitely speak out on issues that are important to you. That's very, very important. But I think also, save your, I have to quote, keep your powder dry. I have to quote Minister Freeland, whose quote has been on my mind. Keep your powder dry, in the sense that, when the real work is going to begin is after the election, when we see what the new government looks like then, and then we have to really work hard to engage and to be really strategic and smart about what that's going to look like. But I think, again, that's not to say that we shouldn't be afraid to call out. I think it's even more important that we do that, call out things that we see as gaps. I'm just responding to another comment too. Yeah, it definitely seemed, certainly ministers who announced they were not running were not part of the new cabinet. That was part of the rationale, in terms of dropping down from 37 cabinet ministers to 24, which is a big drop. That being said, there are some who are planning to still be around who were not, put back in cabinet, and Karina Gold is the one that I think comes to mind for a lot of people, given that she was a leadership candidate, and is seen as a more progressive voice in the party. But yeah, that was part of the pragmatics of it for sure. And I think, also, there's already been criticism from the Conservative Party as well, saying, well, I think there was the analysis was that 87% of these ministers are former Trudeau ministers. At this point, having been in power for as long as the Liberals have been, it would be hard not to be having ministers. I'm not sure who they'd be going to, frankly, if they were going to try and pick ministers who hadn't been in the government already. There's a lot of people who are in the caucus at this point, have solid cabinet experience, and there's no reason not to draw on those people at this time. So I get that they're trying to put some daylight between them and Trudeau. I don't think that having a lot of ministers who are the same necessarily impacts that, in my view, at least. So yeah, so what am I saying? I'm saying that, I don't like this. It's not great. I think people are very, very rightfully very concerned these days, given what we've seen in terms of a massive erosion of, gender equality, to us LGBTQ plus rights coming from south of the border, as well as the absolute, devastating gutting of U.S. foreign aid. And I think it's very reasonable. Oh, there's one of my cats. To be concerned, about this kind of signaling around diversity and inclusion, disability. All of that has a lot more resonance, even just in this current moment. That being said, I think that, we will have to wait and see if there's an election very soon, what will happen during that election and what will come out the other side of that, and be engaging at that time as well. And to really be pushing to see what are the economic commitments that are kept, what are the funding commitments that are kept, and are they still funding the really critical programs, and a lot of the really important work that the foundations have already been laid for with the current government. And I think those are things that we should be focusing on as well. It would be great if we had some kind of response on any of these issues. I mean, I've been discouraged to see that media coverage of the question of wage and others being dropped has been very minimal. And I do think that there is a need for some accountability. So I think that would be good to see a bit more of a response or reflection from the new government, and some assurances as well, because I think at this day and age, the optics and the symbolism are critically important as well. But at this point, I don't think there's, just frankly, luckily we don't have any kind of Doge-style chainsaw business going on. There's not a lot of time in any kind of government bureaucracy sense to make any substantive changes. And I think we need to do a bit of waiting and seeing to see what this is all going to shake down to as well. So yeah, those are kind of my thoughts at this point. I'm open to questions if people have questions as well. And if there's anything that I've not mentioned or missed, I think I'm definitely open to hearing any questions or clarification. But that's kind of my take on where we're sitting right now. And my advice is stay vigilant, keep paying attention, and let's just see where things shake down over the next couple of weeks and even the next 6 weeks or so. And keep on asking for accountability and really pushing for, the kind of progressive Canada that we want to see as well. So if there aren't any questions at this point, I'm going to wrap up. Feel free to subscribe to my newsletter. I'll come on live again over the coming weeks as well. I'm going to be in Ottawa next week for some meetings, and I'm hoping to maybe try and dig out a bit more information from some of my own contacts. And if I do, I will certainly be going live at some point to share some of that. And if you're interested in digging into all of this in a more informal and more in-depth setting, I am having a workshop on Friday, and if you want any information on that, you can go to my LinkedIn page and you'll see registration link there as well. So thanks everyone for joining, and thanks for the lively discussion. And looking forward to hearing from all of you as well as this conversation continues.